Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I believe we have so much to learn from our First Nations people about connection and respect, not just for the land on which we live, but the people with which we interact and the planet as a whole. Well, over the last couple of years, I have been increasingly focusing on workplace well-being. I just feel it's a great focus, a great opportunity to impact positively on people's lives in the workplace, but also their families that they live with. So this is an opportunity to reach a lot of people and make a very big difference. And interesting developments have occurred legally in Australia and are happening globally, but a recognition that perhaps the idea of work-life balance was a very 20th century concept, and perhaps what we all need to be looking at now is a life balance. My guest today is Mike Hagan, who is all about creating better workplaces. Now, Mike is a mental health workplace consultant with over 20 years of experience managing health, safety and well-being and human resources in both public and private sectors. Now, as a senior executive for a very large international company, Mike has implemented holistic mental health and well-being strategies designed to remove the prejudice and stigma associated with mental illness in the workplace, as well as helping organisations implement pragmatic processes and practices that have resulted in a positive commercial outcomes for the businesses, along with improved employee engagement and wellness. And yes, there are holistic thinkers moving into every space, not just healthcare, not just agriculture, but creating better workplaces as well. And I hope to join those ranks. I have joined those ranks. As I said, it's been a focus for me as well. Mike's career path has provided him with a comprehensive overview of the legal, economic, and moral factors that are prerequisites today in enabling business leaders to meet their obligations. And then, yes, as you will hear, recent initiatives globally and in many state governments here in Australia, the legal obligations on corporations and their leaders are very real. This is all to provide a duty of care to their employees, whilst not forgetting to look after their own mental health and well-being in the process. Paradoxically, the very people, leaders, who are given the responsibility are themselves often the most stressed and stand to gain the most from any well-being initiatives within the workplace. Throughout all of this, Mike draws on his own diverse career journey as well as his own mental health journey, which he shares with us today. As an accomplished and respected coach and mentor, Mike has, over the years, supported many individuals to overcome significant mental health challenges created as a result of their working environments, practices, and behaviours. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Mike Hagan. Welcome to the show, Mike.
G'day, Ron. How are you?
I'm very well. We're going to be talking about that as well today. I know, workplace wellness has become a huge topic. I mean, it always was, but it's really been elevated to a whole new level. And the whole subject of mental health in general is a big one. I mean, I know it's a subject that's not easy for anyone to talk about, and particularly for men. And I speak from personal experience here. I think men have a more difficult time. And I know you're passionate about this on a personal and professional level. Can we talk about that and why it's okay not to be okay?
Of course, Ron, of course. Yeah, so I've been around mental health, whether I knew it or not, for most of my career. What I mean by that is, so you're probably gathering from this accent already that I'm not originally from Melbourne and Ferntree. And I actually came through the ranks many, many years ago in the nuclear industry in the United Kingdom. To give you the elevator pitch, which is a very short bio, actually a fitter and turner originally, and then got involved with health and safety as a health and safety rep, as many people do. Through that journey, I then went back and done some studying in my sort of mid to late 20s. It's much easier when you're 15 and 16, I must add. But I went back and I was trained up in the organisation that I worked for, and I ended up as a plant manager on a nuclear waste silo.
Wow.
And yeah, there's not many of those about. It's funny, you know, Ron, the question I get asked most when I talk about the nuclear industry is it really like The Simpsons? And obviously, having signed the Official Secrets Act, I can't comment either way. But it was during that time, my own personal experience from mental health eventuated, and I thought I had insomnia and couldn't sleep at night, couldn't put my finger on it at all. And that led to feeling anxious quite a lot of the time, and not when you're front and centre on a nuclear plant. It would be a supermarket in the UK's equivalent of Bunnings, and I just didn't want to talk about it because I thought there was something wrong. And eventually, I had a colleague who I used to work with. He was very old school. I was also a union representative for many years, and this guy was. He was in the union ranks, hard as nails, and he opened up one day and told everybody about he had work-related stress. And what he described, I thought, has this guy been following me around? He's just described exactly what I'm feeling. So that sort of gave me an entry point to start a conversation after 5 years of not talking about it.
Wow. So how long had you been working in the industry at that point?
Well, I set off there as an apprentice, so a young 16-year-old, and by this point I'd probably been in the industry for maybe 12, 15 years.
Wow. And the last 5 years, it took you 5 years for that penny to drop, that maybe this was more than just not feeling at my best.
It did, Ron. It took me 5 years even to tell my wife about it. It was just I assumed there was something wrong, and how it eventuated, I then went to see a doctor, and I went to see the doctor and said, "Look, this is how I've been feeling." And he said, I think it's. He said, "What do you do for a living?" So I explained, and he said, "Yeah." He said, "I think it's stress, and I think it's work related." So, being male, I said, "Of course it's not." And I laughed, and he laughed. And he said, "You're the first this week, Mike." He said, "It's pretty common." He said, "Well, there's things we can do." And he said, "The first thing I'd recommend is you go and speak to your organisation. You go and speak to work." So I did, and that was an interesting conversation because, I talk about the narrative around well-being, and what I said back then was I went to see my boss and said, "Look, I've been to see a doctor, and he said I've got work-related stress, but please don't think I'm damaged goods."
Well, that's the first reaction, isn't it? We don't want to admitted vulnerability.
It is, but I always reflect on that and think, that's where my head was. You're damaged goods if you've got a mental health challenge. It's you wouldn't say that with a cruciate ligament tear, but and the organisation were fantastic, and they clearly had dealt with this a lot and had professionals in place, and they were very supportive. And then I started to work through and better understand not only mental health, but how my behaviours were, I guess, exasperating, and the habits that you form when you're keeping something to yourself for that long. And went back and done a lot of learning and reflection and some further qualifications. And the irony was, that's when I stepped across into OHS, into health and safety. And I went full circle, and I ended up as the safety manager for the nuclear plant that I used to look after. So,
how long ago are we talking now?
So I moved to Australia 16 years ago, and prior to that I was all said and done about 25 years in the nuclear game.
Wow, that gives you, well, gee, and moving into the OHS, well, we're talking about people here, not just plants, the nuclear plants. The pressure on people in those plants must be, well, huge.
It's an interesting and much maligned and much misunderstood industry, the nuclear industry. So to give you an example, the technology, if you're putting technology around, now I'm 15 years out of the game, so it might have moved a little bit since then, but if you're going to build any safety apparatus, something that contains radioactivity or contamination, the equipment you use has to have a failure rate of 10 to the minus 6. So a 1 in a million failure rate, and you have to have 2 of them. And the 2 pieces of kit have to work on different technologies. So if there's a failure of a technology type, you've still got this 10 to the minus 6. So the levels of technical integrity around the systems is extreme. But what about me and you? If we have a Monday or a Friday, or that still requires a person to press that button and to initiate the process on many occasions. And really speaking, the human, as ever, it's the weakest link. So yeah, it's an interesting space. So I actually started working with on some projects. I had a very enlightened director at the time there, well ahead of his time, and he asked me to go to grassroots level and start to talk to people around some of the softer OHS skills as they were saying at the time. It was less about machine guarding and more about where people were and how they were traveling and why they behaved in certain ways. So that was the first real project I was involved with. We dubbed it the horse's mouth because we were going to go back to the horse's mouth and ask people how they felt at work, why they'd done certain things at work. And that was a real interesting learning curve.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, we are dealing with individuals, whether we're talking about the CEOs of companies or the cleaners, and how they show up to work is a very individual experience.
Yeah, and I still think we scratch the surface. At least we're having conversations today. And we've in Australia. Australia is in my opinion, very far ahead of the curve in terms of the conversations and the level of maturity around mental health. And it does differ culturally from country to country, where it can be an open conversation. But as you correctly said earlier on, men, we're not always an open book. I know some people doing some great work in that space around men's health and to particularly make environments where it's easier for men to go and have conversations. I've never come across the concept of the man sheds, which they've got in Australia, which is a great mental health initiative. So the conversation started. It needs to go a lot further, and it needs to become normalised. And the organisations that I've worked in, where I've put in mental health strategies, the usual challenge with the project is what does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? And the only thing I ever try and achieve is to instill a culture in an organisation where it's a normal conversation to talk about your anxiety or your mental health challenge in the same way you would talk about the cruciate ligament that you pulled kicking the footy with the kids at the weekend. It's normalising that conversation really, Ron.
It's one of the interesting things. I mean, I've observed as a father watching my daughters grow up and watching my nephews grow up as well, and having grown up as a boy and a man myself, to see how different play is at a very young age and how that prepares us and gives us the vocabulary almost. Because I know my wife, and still to this day, will say to me, "What's wrong?" And I'll go, "Nothing." And she knows something's wrong. And it actually takes me a day or two for me to articulate in my own head. This is a conversation going on in my own head, even to this day, about what is wrong. And I just don't. I think this man shed thing. We did a program on the man cave, which is addressing that in young teenagers and school children, but we just don't have that. We're better off talking about the cruciate ligament, aren't we?
Oh, it's a much more comfortable conversation to have, really. And look, as a species, generally we avoid difficult situations. That's how we've evolved as a species. And now we're asking people to go and have challenging conversations. That it's a really good thing to start the conversation, but we're not always best equipping people to close those conversations out. And that's a challenge. That's across all gender, really. But men particularly, we can be slow to start that conversation and to eventuate it for sure.
It could also explain why our life expectancy is a little bit shorter than women's, but there could be a few other factors there.
I'll leave that to your medical expertise and won't.
Yeah.
I won't get myself in a world of trouble by
But when
passing
you
comments.
when you were OH&S at this nuclear plant, and you were in that for quite a few years, I'm assuming, what was some of the initiatives when you did start that conversation? 15 or 20 years ago. What was some of the initiatives early on that tried to address those? Because it's interesting to see how they may have changed over the years.
I think it's things that we see now as more as a standard practice, and it was about what I always term as genuine consultation. So there's always been, enshrined within OHS law forever. There's always been the rights around consultation, but it was really starting the conversation with the people who are, as we used to say, on the coal face, they know what happens on night shift. I always talk about culture as three circles, and if I had my whiteboard, I would write all this out. Where you get, so if you picture there's three circles and they intertwine, and your culture sits in the middle, and this model applies not only to mental health and to many things. And the three circles of influence, really, it's what I would term as the formal organisation. So where there's policies and there's processes, the things that we write down, and then there's the second circle, really, of influence is the informal organisation. So every organization's got an informal organization, that's epitomized by, if you want to get that done, see Frank on the night shift or Betty on afternoon shift. She knows a way around that. And then the third part is the individual. So you've got the individual and all the attributes and baggage that we all bring along, Ron. And, why we're all plumbed in different ways. There's cultural issues, there's behavioral issues, there's education. So when you think about that unholy trinity, think of it from a business point of view. How much influence have you got over the formal organization? You've got 100%. You write the policies, you write the procedures, you run the training script. The informal, well, the informal only really prospers when the formal structure isn't good. The informal is just a workaround for the things that don't work. So a lot of the initiatives we put in place, it was about, well, tell us what really happens. And I used to look back on some of the IR topics of the 80s and the 90s, where the threat was, we'll work to rule. We're going to
Hmm.
follow the rules, and that was a
That was a
back in the
threat.
day, that was a legitimate industrial relation. And I always used to think, well, it's a bloody nuclear plant. I kind of hope everybody is following the rules. So yeah, you've got your informal organisation, you've got your formal organisation, then you've got the individuals. How much influence have you got over those? And we used to say, well, you sleep for a third of the day, you work for a third of the day, and hopefully for the third of the day or third of your life, you do something you enjoy. I don't think it's that simple. I think now, and I think it's commonly acknowledged now, that the workplace is the single biggest influencer on most mental health and well-being topics. So I guess that's a very, very windy answer to a short question. We concentrated a lot of initiatives around making sure we didn't need an informal organisation. And we've done that through working with the individuals that knew how things happened, and just having a long hard stare at the formal processes and procedures. And that's what I've spent probably the rest of my career doing. People that have worked with me will be getting tired of me seeing, get it down to one page, and I want to see big text and pictures, because if you can't get somebody's attention with one page, it's unlikely they're going to read the page two, because that's how we are as humans.
Interesting to hear you say, though, that the more successful or the better the policy is, the less the informal policy has an influence. And I mean, yeah, and it's also, I'm sure there was a report just recently coming out of, I think it's UKG, which is a big HR firm, that said 70% of people that were surveyed said that their work manager had more of an influence on their mental health than their own partner, or equal to their own partner, and more than their doctor or their therapist.
Yeah, I think I've actually read that report, Ron, and it's when you think about in the workplace, and I'll generalize a little bit, but when I speak to people, the causes of stress and challenges to mental health in the workplace, it's not the flickering light, it's not the forklifts make too much noise, and we've got that side of safety all boxed off, really, all by and large. It's the behaviours you encounter and the things that fester. If you're working in an organisation that, I often say you're not going to address mental health with bowls of fruit on a Friday. I've never known anybody feel better after eating a banana. It just doesn't work that way. If your biggest concern in the organisation is you actually don't think you've been paid appropriately and you haven't been for a number of years, or you've seen people not being appropriately managed when the behaviour hasn't been correct, those things can gnaw away at a person, and they can gnaw away at the fabric of an organisation. And it doesn't matter how many policies and procedures you have in place, if the behaviours, they use the term toxic if it's a toxic organisation, that begins, and ends with leadership. If leadership is strong and authentic and understands the wellness discussion and fairness, wellness and fairness are hand in hand. If the organisation has fair practices, it has people who can be approached and you can have a reasoned conversation with. And look, none of us are right all the time, none of us are wrong all the time. But if you don't feel you can have an open conversation, especially with the people who determine, what you're going to do from now through the rest of your career potentially, that's a big problem. That's a big problem. So I do believe that. I think if you're unfortunate to have somebody who hasn't got your best interest at heart in the workplace, get out.
Yeah.
Would be my advice.
Yeah, wow. But then we're about to leave the nuclear industry, but I can't help but ask you, because we digress here from workplace wellness, but in terms of energy, you have had an insight. You've talked about a 1 in a million times 2 fail safe,
Yeah.
things. I mean, it hasn't got a bad rap, nuclear energy. Is that something we should be exploring? And do you feel,
I think
what do you feel?
it's got a terrible rap,
Yeah,
and it's a much maligned industry, and it's such an easy industry sector to rally against. But the World Health Organization say that you're safer working on a nuclear plant than you are in a CBD.
right.
That's
I
not
thought
mine.
you were. I
That's
thought you were going to say coal mine, but that's something we can all relate to. The
yeah,
CBD.
and that's down to the pollution, really.
Mm.
It's over the last 50 years, there's been over 100 million people have died through the impacts of fossil fuel on the environment. Now, there are certainly challenges around nuclear, but there's a climate scientist, James Hansen, and he has put a piece of work together that says that because of the nuclear power plants that have existed and negated the use for further fossil fuel, it's responsible for saving 1.8 million lives over the history of the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry, they say that one of the pivotal things came out of Hollywood, and it was the movie The China Syndrome, which dealt with a fictitious plant and a runaway reactor. And 21 days after the film was released, 3 Mile Island happened in the US, which was an issue with a reactor. Over the next 9 years, there was 67 nuclear plant builds scrapped in the US because public opinion had swung so far. Best piece of PA a Hollywood movie has ever had. But yeah, so the nuclear industry, the technology today, think about the technology on your wrist, think about the technology in your car. That technology is advanced at the same rates in the nuclear industry. But when people rally against the nuclear industry, they'll show you a picture of, an atomic mushroom, which is so far removed from what a nuclear plant actually does. The thought or the debate now has swung round to, for a carbon neutral future, nuclear has to be part of that, but it has to be a strategic and a holistic approach. So all I would say to people is go and read some things. There's a chap called Michael Schellenberger, who was a very anti-nuclear enviro author, I think he was originally, in the US, and he's gone back to revisit the topic, and he presents quite an interesting view of where nuclear would sit in a carbon-free future. So when you think about, people say, well, what about the waste? And you think about the waste is often vitrified, so it's encased in glass, and it's put into secure bunkers, and it's monitored, and it sits there. Solar panels, there is still no end of life for solar panels. They're still going to hold lead, cadmium, there's a lot of heavy metals in there. They will be toxic forever. And where does e-waste go? We tend to send the e-waste overseas to countries that have not fantastic regulatory processes. So it's a whole interesting debate. So again, a long answer to a short question, Ron, and I apologise for that.
No.
But
I think it's good. It's great.
I think the in terms of it's the only genuinely, no, it's not the only, it's the major clean power source that we have at our disposal at the moment, because solar panels and wind power, it's not going to power cities. The battery capacities that we have to store the energy. There was a really interesting piece it was in Germany in 2016. So they increased the volume of solar panels by 4% in 2016, which resulted in a 3% loss in energy efficiency from the previous year.
Mm-hmm.
It just wasn't as sunny in Germany that year.
Yeah.
And they had a similar experience with wind turbines. They increased the number of wind turbines by 11%, and the efficiency dropped by 2%. It wasn't that windy in Germany that year. So there's a part for all of that technology and all of that energy, but I think to disregard nuclear as a viable part of a carbon-free future, I think, I would encourage people to read some of the current literature around the topic.
Yeah. And I imagine building nuclear sites on earthquake zones probably isn't a great part of planning and wouldn't be considered a holistic approach.
That's correct. And yeah, there's been quite a lot of commentary around that since, Fukushima, obviously. But again, it's down to the human.
Yep.
It wasn't a piece of software that determined where to build the plants.
But coming back to workplace wellness, because that's something we're both very interested and passionate about, you then came to Australia and you stepped into a role with a company that I think a lot of people are familiar with the name, but I learned something about the whole company ethos that I was really impressed with. But tell us about your next move, because that's where you've been for most of the time since then, up until a week or two ago.
That's correct. So I want the organisation that you're talking about is Bosch, the German company. So I won't speak on their behalf because, as you correctly said, I stepped away a couple of weeks ago from a fantastic organisation that are doing some great things. And I imagine what you're talking to is the fact that they're owned by a charitable foundation.
Yes.
And that's not something that that Bosch choose to publish. It's part of the company's constitution, which has came down from Robert Bosch, who died in 1943. And Bosch's ethos is invented for life. So all the products, all the services that they provide with a view to improving the quality of life. And they're owned by a charitable foundation. And the charitable foundation determines, by and large, where the profits go, and the profits are used through the foundation looks after 6 areas of philanthropy, and it's to do with internationalism, with education, science, medicine. So I always thought, when you have your most taxing day at an organisation like that, at least you're working towards a great cause. And yeah, they're a fantastic organisation. I used to say to people it was the second best kept secret in the world, and then people would ask me what was the best kept secret in the world, and clearly I couldn't tell them, Ron, because it's so
nicely set up there, Mike. Nicely set up. But it is. I mean, I was really impressed with that, and in a time in our history, economically, politically, where shareholders' supremacy seems to trump everything else, and I use that term very advisedly, it trumps everything else, shareholders' supremacy, to have a company like that and that doesn't even go out and promote that. I mean, that is just insane. I mean, that must drive their marketing division totally crazy, because it's such a useful thing. I mean, such a great thing.
I used to say the marketing guys would like to put it on a blimp above all the factories, but
yes,
that just isn't how it rolls. So no, it's a non-publicised values piece that makes it the great organisation that it is, really.
But your role there, Mike. Let's talk about your role there.
So my entry point was actually from an OHS chair. So that was the starting point, and through a number of changes and a bit of a journey, I ended up as a general manager looking after not only health and safety but HR and the wellness area, or the claims areas it used to be termed, and and it was a real opportunity to work in a corporate environment where you can look at the wellness topic holistically. And I talk about to organizations now about there needs to be a holistic approach, and the holistic approach to me is it's from hire to retire. It's how you brand yourself when people are reading the LinkedIn ad. There should the wording around there should be a clear indication that wellness is valued in the work environment. Through to if you think of your common touch points in an organization, you'll join and you'll be inducted, and you may be buddied up with somebody for a while, and then there'll be the training courses that you go through, and you repeat the training courses. And wellness and fairness, that there should be cornerstones of all those conversations. It should be a feature in every interview, whether internal or external, and right down to the you want to hear it in the retirement speeches. And that's what we worked really, really hard and put a holistic strategy in place there. And that's what I've shared with other organizations to some success. I think one of the challenges there is today is because the legislation and the evolving legislation in particular regarding mental health in the workplace, or psychosocial risk as we term it, or psychosocial factors, it comes from the framework of OHS legislation. So it's clearly an OHS problem. So we'll give it to the OHS teams, bless them. By the time it gets to an OHS topic, the damage has been done by and large from a wellness point of view. It really needs to be all the factors I mentioned earlier, that if people think or people know that in an environment where fairness is valued and they can have an open conversation, that is much more effective than the bowls of fruit on a Friday. And many years ago, I went to an organisation. So I was briefly a consultant for a while when I first came to Australia, prior to working for Bosch. And I remember going into one organisation, and the general manager proudly told me that they have fruit on Fridays. So, yeah.
Now, you've used the word holistic a few times, and I think the idea of a holistic context overlying everything that happens within a company. We've explored this theme, obviously, holistic, something I'm very passionate about, and I've spoken to a guy, Alan Savory, is a mentor of mine, who talks about holistic management and says overlying every decision that governments, corporations, individuals make should be a holistic context. For example, we're not going to do anything that's bad for your health or the health of the planet. That would be a holistic context. What does holistic mean to you?
Great question. So I'll do what I do and digress a little bit around the answer, but I will land at some point, Ron. Holistic, all-encompassing. Now, I'm not saying that an organisation has to become a commune and just spend all our time meditating and doing Zen things. That's not what I'm saying at all. And what I'm putting out there is that wellness is the oil in the engine for an organisation. We'll have an organisation with parts that come into contact with each other and perform certain activities, but without the oil around the engine, it's going to be a fairly short and quick end. So holistic, I used the term earlier from hire to retire, and it is every touch point through the cycle of the employment experience. The one I would focus on mainly, who decides on what is the scope of that holistic approach, and it starts with the top. It starts with the senior person in the organization, and it's quite a challenging conversation in many ways, because when you go to an organization and you talk about the culture around wellness, you're talking to probably the person who's under the most pressure in the organization. And I often I've got a bit of a soft spot really around executives, because they've got really, really difficult jobs, really, really stressful jobs. And you can be talking about, the facts and the figures and what it looks like to an organization. And they're not only having to listen to the conversation from, the organizational point of view and the strategic point of view. They could be thinking, gee, you're talking about how I feel when I go home. So it's really, and leadership traditionally, it's a strong position, and you've got to stand up and you've got to be at the front of the boat and you've got to point to the direction. Where's the permission to be vulnerable there? So I spend a lot of time. I do executive coaching as well, and helping executives just to give themselves a break, and acknowledge that they're also human and in a significant position. The the argument around the business case around and the ROI on wellness in the workplace, it's a no-brainer. It's the numbers, and I'm happy to talk to the numbers. But the people that you're asking to make those decisions, let's just bear in mind that they have Mondays and Fridays as well.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I think that is one of the barriers that a lot of HR people encounter. And it's ironic, really, because as you say, the managers are often the most stressed of all, the leaders, the executives, is buy-in, leadership buy-in. So
Absolutely.
let's talk about. I mean, we're going to get into some of the issues and challenges, but let's go with that first one, and that is, what is the return on investment? I know you shared with me some things about physical and mental injury in workplace covers, but just share with the listener, what is the return on investment?
So whenever I'm approaching any topic, I'll always talk about the moral, the legal, and the economic aspects. So there's always those three aspects around any business case. Now, depending how you speak to, might change the order that you're running. But I'm going to talk to the economics, to the dollar for a moment. And I'm always a little bit uncomfortable doing this because I do it to prove a point that there is a return on investment that every organization should make. But I'm also aware I'm talking dollars when I'm talking about people that are significantly impacted. So if you just put a marker in that one for a moment. So the average costs for a mental health claim in Victoria, state of Victoria, 2020 was $200,000 to $200,000. Compare that to a non-psychological claim, a non-mental health claim, about 96. So what does that 200 actually mean? I've had this conversation with a number of business owners. And I said, okay, then. So let's talk about EBIT, your earnings before interest and tax. The bit you've got left in your pocket when you finish doing business. How much do you have to actually generate in terms of revenue to get that 200,000 from one claim back? So if you've got a healthy EBIT of 20%, you're looking for another million revenue because you've had one mental health claim. It's staggering. You can show me an organization that can't put a healthy strategy in place for less than 200,000, and they're not doing the right things. I've put strategies in place for less than half of that in very large organizations. And I remember speaking to a financial colleague, and it was another company a couple of years ago, and they said, "Where's he sat on the profit and loss? Where does it show on the ledger?" Yeah, it doesn't. And I'm only talking about insured costs. Any OHS person will tell you about the iceberg, and the iceberg where only 11% of the costs are visible. I'm only talking about the bit you can see. So the costs to industry and the impact of individuals, hugely significant. But I always say it's a no-brainer. The business case, it's always been much easier to prove a business case around mental health than your traditional OHS.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a latent OHS problem in your machine, and it's there and it's not good, but nobody's being harmed by it. If you've got a wellness issue, it's impacting your business now. It's impacting your business today to some level.
Yes. And you make the point about only 11% being visible, the tip of the iceberg, because the cost of turning over staff, the cost of absenteeism, the pressure it puts on others in the workplace that are left behind. It's just a snowballing effect, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an avalanche. And recruiting has never been harder. We're in, so I'll speak to, I know your podcast goes worldwide, but in Australia at the moment, we're enjoying some of the lowest unemployment rates since the mid-70s. So to go out and actually recruit people and find people is extremely difficult at the moment and extremely costly. So again, apologies for speaking dollars when I'm talking about people's wellness and pain and suffering, but yeah, think about those numbers.
Yes. Well, you mentioned there were three aspects, and morally, legally, and economically. And Australia has, and it was interesting to hear you say we're leading, because certainly in Victoria, in New South Wales and Queensland, Victoria on the eastern seaboard, and I think it's going national. There's new legislation introduced in October last year, in New South Wales at least, that put a legal obligation on not just companies but their leaders. Is that right, Mike? There's a legal obligation now to manage or mitigate psychosocial risk. Is that have I got that right?
I'll put a little bit more colour around that, Ron. So it's different states and territories that are in the process of implementing the psychosocial health regulation. And what it is, it's a piece of legislation that introduces some of the terminology we would now use and some of the obligations around duty of care, particularly from a psychosocial or a wellness point of view, into the legislation that already exists. So all the states and territories, apart from Victoria, are under the workplace health and safety regulations. Victoria, for reasons that I won't go into, didn't cross over to those regulations and everybody else did. So Queensland, all the other states have now put in a version of the psychosocial health regulations, which says the duty of care that you had to provide, to consult, to have a safe working place, all the things that we know and love around OHS, there's now an obligation from a wellness point of view, a mental health point of view. Where Victoria differs, Victoria, there isn't, as we speak today, I checked last week, there isn't a definitive date that they talked about the end of Q1 this year that the regulations would go live in Victoria. The regulations are going to be different in Victoria. There's more obligations on an organisation. So one of the points of difference in Victoria is that for organisations of a certain size, there's an obligation to report to WorkSafe where there has been any complaints around discrimination, sexual harassment or discrimination, and to make those reports on a 6-monthly basis. So when you think about that, that's quite a game changer. You always had to report for fatalities, for falls from height, for serious injuries. Now they're saying, but if there is an investigation around something that can cause mental harm and distress, we want to know every 6 months. So there's Victoria have done what they do sometimes, and they've took a slightly different path. But yeah, the legislation, there's always been an obligation to look after people's health and well-being. This is really a little bit retrospective to say yes, but now these terms need to be better defined, and the leadership of organisations will be held responsible. So we're talking again about Victoria, where the OHS legislation lives in as criminal legislation. It's not civil legislation. For breaches of health and safety, you're in the same courts as the gangsters and the people that do terrible things. So the legislative landscape is changing very, very quickly. It's built on, by and large, around an international standard, 45003. So if you need to get an early night and want some light reading, it's a great standard, and that really builds a very robust framework for what or how wellness should be managed in an organisation. It's very, very holistic. It talks about from the inductions, the trainings, the supervision, etc. And it clearly, as you mentioned, it clearly puts the responsibility with the senior people, the company directors. And then this is, when you think about, if you go back 15 years and you talk to a company director, if a forklift hits you, Ron, God forbid, or if a forklift hits me, we're done. That's it. If I work a 60-hour week for a year and you work a 60-hour for a week, it might just bounce off you, but it might significantly damage my well-being. So all of a sudden we've got a duty of care, the legal term of duty of care. You've got to do what's reasonably practicable. I think we've invented a new language based in fog, and now we're saying, okay, I can understand the forklift analogy, the fall from height, you're going to land, it's going to be bad. But now we've got a hazard that's not that well defined, that it impacts Mike, but it doesn't impact Ron. How do I manage that? How do I manage that? How do I know I've done enough? And they're the questions I'm getting every week. What is it that we need to do? How do we know it's working?
Well, I know in medicine, the move is hopefully towards personalised medicine, because we are all individuals, and what's stressful to me may not be stressful to you, but it doesn't mean it's not stressful to you. And it's interesting to hear you talk about, because internationally that ISO 45003 has certainly set a standard. When I became aware of this legislation in New South Wales, and I think it's going to be rolled out nationally, at the same time, the Grattan Institute just recently released in February of 2023. Now, they're a big research organisation for our international listeners. Put out a report saying that Australia was sleepwalking into a healthcare disaster. And so I saw these two things juxtaposed on one another. Here is an admission that government has failed in public health. And on the other hand, I think, in rugby, it's used to be called a hospital pass. You'd pass the ball to somebody else to take the heavy tackle. And this is what actually I can see is happening for organizations. I mean, it's a great opportunity. And you talk about moral and legal and economic case. Well, the moral case for a third of our lives to be focused on health and wellness is a pretty compelling argument. I mean, we really have handed corporations a tough gig.
We have. I'll just flash back to something you said then that reminded me of a conversation I had only last week, where somebody was putting an argument to me. They said, we don't have a health system. We've got a sickness system.
Yes, well, this is a common theme on this podcast, Mike.
Yeah, we've got a system that it's reactive, and there are proactive elements there, by and large, all of which have came in the last 20 years, and are far outweighed by the reactive aspects of the sickness system that we have. The load, or the challenge, I guess, that we're putting in, not just corporates, because there's 42% of Australians work in organisations of less than 50 people. They're organisations that haven't got big budgets to do things, but almost half of the workforce that we have, is out there. So it's not just a corporate topic. And I've talked corporate for a while, but and I'm spending a bit of time talking to small to medium enterprises. I'm speaking to a Chamber of Commerce later this week regarding what can a small organisation do. We don't even have a health and safety person. What can we do? And there is some fantastic and free resources available from, so going back to the legislation, it won't go national as a piece of legislation, but it will be enacted nationally via each state and territory. And there's some excellent information out there that tells you what you need to do. But unfortunately, it still needs a bit of decoding. As a small business owner that's got a microbrewery or a fruit and veg distributor, it's not an easy read, and that's where they need people to go in and to break this down and not monetize it. They need to be able to go out and get some short, sharp direction in terms of, if you do these things, you can negate these things, and that's actually a piece of it's a piece of work that I'm pulling together now, and I'm going back to the horse's mouth and saying, well, what do you know and what do you not know? Because the first thing, whether you're a corporate organisation or you're a John, Paul, George, and Ringo who've got a removal firm, what do you know today? What are the problems today that you might have? And it's starting that conversation, because until you know what your challenges are, it's very, very difficult to put a solution in place. And again, across such a broad topic that impacts so many individuals out there, and it impacts some and not others. So it's a really, really challenging one for any business or any organisation to manage.
Again, talking to people, asking how they are. How are you okay? This is how we started our conversation. You've now, if I was going to ask you if you were going to design the perfect HR system, what would you do? But you've just found out that the company that you've been head of, the HR division, has won a Global Health and Safety Initiative Award. Well, that's a reflection of something being done right. I wondered if you could tell us what it was. I mean, you've obviously outlined some of the things holistically that you've been doing there.
Yeah. Look, again, I won't talk on Bosch's behalf because I'm no longer employed by them. But
generically,
we put a strategy in place in Australia and New Zealand, and that's been acknowledged at a global level.
Mm-hmm.
And ahead of many other projects. So they'll look for a project that shows initiative and value add every year. And the announcement hasn't got out, but it may have done very, very well and took out the first place. So, I'm absolutely thrilled for the guys who will now continue to put that strategy in place. And I'll just talk a little bit to the points of difference. The question that you often get when you're putting a mental health strategy in place is, how do we know it's working? The first question is, what does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we know it's working? And, if you look at 45003, there's suggested, measures for improvement. We took the usual, ROI type KPIs. We could monitor progress, but we also took another set of metrics and how many of the senior leadership group attend the wellness events that are scheduled. So most organizations, or many organizations, they'll schedule lunchtime events and after hours events around wellness, and whether it be yoga classes or God forbid bowls of fruit. But how many of the executive actually show for those? And that was one of the questions that I got from a couple of organizations to say, well, yeah, they're available, but you never see the senior management going along. Now, I don't think I look good in a leotard. I'll put that out there. But the fact that you're present and you participate, and then through your presence in an event, you're adding a legitimacy to it. It's people do what's important to the boss. Invariably, and if the boss is showing an interest around that topic. One of the things that we've done as part of the launch was we asked every senior executive to make a home video, 30 seconds. So I'd said, look, I just need 30 seconds of your time. Easiest request you're going to get today. I want you to do a video. The first part of the sentence is, I look after my own mental health and well-being by, and then fill in the dots. And it was great. It was learned a lot about people and what to get up to when they're not at work. But it really opened up a conversation, and that went global. That went over on the internal systems. Be 400,000 people, I guess we've got to say that. And you got people being vulnerable and talking about what they do to ensure they've got a balance. I don't believe in work-life balance. I just think there's a life balance. And so yeah, some of the key aspects and the focus were around leadership at a senior level, because until you get that senior buy-in, and the team run with it.
Fantastic. I could just imagine that would be a real eye-opener for the whole team. It's interesting too, because you said that in your culture circle of three things, individual health is still there, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I started with this doesn't matter whether you're the executive telling us how I look after my health and well-being, or whoever in an organization. That's a really fundamental question, how does an organization affect that? What are some of the things you've tried and worked that have been there?
Things that I think it's always good to learn from the things you don't get right.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked with organizations where, we run with the Are You OK, which is a great initiative, a fantastic initiative. But what if somebody's not okay on? What if somebody really opens up and says, well, I've got debt issues, and the kids are apparently using drugs, and I don't know how I'm going to make the mortgage at the end of the month. And how do you close the conversation? So I've worked with organizations to back end that conversation to say, okay, then this is where the help is available, etc. And we put a framework around there. One of the things that blew me away, to the point I actually trained up to become an instructor, was the mental health first aid training. That's an Australian thing. Extremely proud to say that. And the mental health first aid training, I would say it's the best 2 days training I would recommend for anybody, because it tells you the unvarnished, this is what mental health is, the unvarnished truth. And it tells you how to start the conversations. It doesn't try to turn you into Freud or a doctor, but it just helps you get people to the people that can help them. So yeah, I was not blown away with the training. I went and followed up and now deliver mental health first aid training, because it's all about the conversation.
Yeah.
It's all about the conversation.
Yeah. Now, another issue that's pretty big in all industries, a lot of industries, is burnout. You know, it's a topic on many people's minds, whether they know it or not. It took, like sounds like, from our initial conversation, it's not always obvious to an individual. How do we define burnout?
But burnout, the term gets thrown around quite a lot. I'm burned out. I'm over this week. I'm just burned out. And burnout is it's actually described by the World Health Organization as a workplace phenomena. It's not described as a sickness. It's described as a workplace phenomena. And they talk about emotional exhaustion, a depersonalization, and a lack of sense of personal accomplishment are the three academic triggers that they'll look for. And what does it actually look like when you're having a conversation with someone? Burnout, you're not going to feel better after the long weekend. You're not going to feel better after the week in Byron Bay. You're still going to come back tired. You're still going to come back fatigued. You find people who were once very, very proactive will have a very, very negative narrative on things, and it's hard to shift and hard to move. So burnout is where too much for too long, and you're not getting the chance to recover. You're not getting the chance to pull back. So people say, well, what's the difference between stress and what's the difference between burnout? The burnout is the long haul. Burnout is where it's not peaks and troughs. That's the best layperson's synopsis I can give around that. But and it's prolific. It's prolific.
Do you have statistics or any idea of how prolific that is, or your own personal? I mean, I
There's
know
there's
the
lots
tough
there's lots of
question.
data. There's lots of data out there. I always think with this topic, it's hard to put a metric you can hang your hat on because, as we mentioned earlier on, we don't like talking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Who knows?
by the time we start picking the statistics up, we're at the back end of the equation
Yeah,
where all the
yeah.
things we've tried haven't worked. But burnout, chronic fatigue, you just can't think positively about things. You're often associated with long hours or big hours where people just are, they're not even functioning at 60% of the best because they're just tired. Somebody once said to me, I knew I was getting towards burnout, Mike, because I was waking up tired. I was waking up tired, and we all know how important, especially I think as we all get a bit older, how important sleep is. And
And how do you think? What I know you've talked about this professionally. How's good ways of managing it? What do you think some strategies for
yeah,
managing burnout are?
I think we've all got to take responsibility for our own health. I think first and foremost, and it's easy to say, oh well, it's just the job I've got, it's just the boss I've got, and I've said those things I think over the years, and especially when I look back to the formative years. So for me, the deal set off getting up at 5:30, and I go and hit the roads. I get out. I'm not a runner. But I live in the Dandenong foothills, so there's lots of hills to get up and down, and I'll do that, and I'll come back and I'll do 10 minutes meditation and 10 minutes yoga and stretches, and again, don't look good in the leotard. I call it yoga for not bendy people, um, and that's the start of the day because I'll wake up and I've got work things in my head because that's how I'm wired. But that walk and it's not. I think it was a bit of a chore for a while, and now I look forward to it. It's the basis for a good day. Um, and um, and then in terms of how I've managed my professional life, I try and compartmentalize things, and I'll put thresholds around things. And for quite a while, I had an alarm that would go off, and it didn't go off at 5 o'clock. It went off a little bit later into the evening, but that was the point where I was going to stop doing that thing and be home, Mike, and be here for my wife. So it really, to me, I don't think there's a silver bullet that works for everybody, but for me, it was about a discipline of. I often say to people when I'm at speaking gigs, I'll ask people how many people have brushed their teeth that morning. Everybody will put their hand up. How many people have meditated this morning? So we do help ourselves, we do look after ourselves, but it's got to be important, and we've got to understand why. And that comes back to the education. So, if I hadn't spoke to a doctor many years ago, and then, a counsellor back in the UK, and learned, what are the things and the behaviours, not getting enough sleep, and all the things that I was doing wrong from a work point of view that weren't good for myself. I thought I was doing a great job for the company, but I wasn't doing a great job for Mike. So it really is getting some perspective and taking some responsibility around looking after yourself and looking after others as well, because community is a huge thing. And the solution for wellness in society is community. It's helping each other. It's asking, are you okay, and genuinely meaning it. You're not asking because it's a certain day where it's celebrated. It's just a normal conversation. I always challenge people and say, look, when you're wanting to redefine or improve the culture in your organization, think about the organization that you want your wife or your son or your daughter to work in, and aspire to that. Start working towards that, because it often gives people a different perspective when you personalize it to say, what would you want for the people that you love.
Gee, Mike, that's a great note for us to finish on. And if people wanting to find you, I know you're just moving into a new phase in your
I am
career.
indeed, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So Mike Hagan Consulting Services,
Hmm.
which oddly enough looks at holistic solutions to mental health in workplaces. So it's an area that was always part of my portfolio for many years, and it's an area that I just love working in. I've seen the negative impacts it can have on an organisation and an individual. I've experienced it, and the solutions aren't that hard. You just need to know what you need to apply in which area. You need to understand your own organisation first. So I've actually picked up a couple of clients where I'm working with them now to just do hold the mirror up and let's look at the organisation. Let's listen to the narrative that we use. Let's listen to the stories that we tell about ourselves. What do we celebrate? And if we're telling those platitudes or those stories about good old finance, that the work there 75 hours a week, and isn't it fantastic? No, it's not. And we need to stop talking about that. We need to stop talking. We need to fix the hours and the resources first, but we need to be careful about the culture that we, through the formal, the informal, and the individuals within the organisation, the culture that we develop. So I'm spending a lot of time around those conversations, and also helping organisations adapt to the oncoming legislation that you mentioned earlier on as well. So there's a lot to do out there. There's a lot of good can be done out there, and we need to do it.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us here today. And thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Much appreciated.
Well, I think as we outlined there, I guess there are 4 reasons for companies and their leaders to engage in a proactive, positive workplace wellbeing initiatives. I mean, the return on investment financially is a no-brainer. There was a study done by Gallup about 10 years ago, and I'm sure it's even worse today. It was done with over 1 million people in 140 countries, and they interviewed millions of people. And what they found was that around 15% of those people were actively engaged in their jobs. About 65 to 70% were indifferent, and the balance were actually actively disengaged or sabotaging their work environment. So that's kind of alarming to think that something like over 80% of people are either indifferent or not engaged in their work. And that, of course, raises all sorts of issues about workload, stresses, stress in the workplace, stress in life, burnout, which we've covered on several occasions recently with Clark Gaither and Sharon Grossman, and of course the wonderful Susie Green from the Positive Psychology Institute. So workplace well-being is part of life. And so this idea of a work-life balance seems a little bit old hat. A life balance seems to be what we should all be focusing on. And the positives about engaging in this are almost a no-brainer. I mean, as I was about to say, the return on investment financially, I mean, some estimates put it at for every $1 spent, there's a $6 return. I think that's probably conservative, but because these initiatives are not particularly costly, but the impact that they have is huge. So financially, there's that. Considering that at least a third of our lives is spent at work, and again, another poll done recently by the big HR firm UKG, which I referenced in the podcast, said that 70% of people interviewed said that their managers had as big an impact on their mental health as their own life partners, and a bigger impact than either their doctor or their therapist. So leaders are really at the core of this. And so we have the financial gain of doing something, the moral responsibility of doing something, and now there is a legal obligation to do something. And in Australia, the legislation is being rolled out, certainly on the east coast of Australia, New South Wales in October 2022, followed by Queensland and Victoria. I think the other states will follow. It's all built around an international standard called the ISO 45003. Which is being embraced globally. So the recognition that workplace well-being is an excellent opportunity to impact positively on people's lives is very real. It's interesting too that the Grattan Institute, which is a major research institute here in Australia, published a report in February 2023, just a few weeks or months ago, saying that Australia was sleepwalking to a healthcare disaster. And the reason it was because only 2 to 3% of our expenditure is on prevention. And that's a whole story about confusing and contradictory health messages, because health and food and the environment have become commodities. Our health has become a commodity. And while good health may make sense, it doesn't make dollars for the companies that are often behind many of the public health messages that we hear and the evidence-based marketing or medicine that is practiced. And this is a story that for most people is very easy to miss, but once you hear it, very difficult to ignore. So these initiatives are very positive. And finally, the biggest potential gain, because the paradox is that these very leaders that are being asked to deal with this very real and difficult problem are often the most stressed themselves. So the biggest payback here is not financial, it's not moral, it's not legal, it's in the potential health benefits to the very leaders themselves. So creating a better workplace is something I'm feeling particularly passionate about now and into the future. And talking to someone like Mike Hagan, and I'll, of course, have links to Mike's website. Hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.